The train wheezed to a stop at Millbrook Station, Colorado Territory, September 1879. Steam hissed from beneath the great iron beast as passengers began to emerge from the cramped cars, stretching their legs and breathing in the thin mountain air. Among them stepped a young woman in a grey travelling dress, her movements careful and deliberate, as if each step required conscious thought. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Catherine Walsh clutched a worn leather satchel to her chest, her knuckles white against the dark material. Her face held no expression, not anticipation, not fear, not even curiosity about this new place that was supposed to become her home. The other passengers hurried past her, eager to reach their destinations, but Catherine remained motionless on the platform, studying the dusty street beyond, with eyes that seemed to see everything and nothing at once. The station master, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained whiskers, approached her with a clipboard in hand. "You be Miss Walsh, the bride for Mr. Henderson." Catherine nodded once, a barely perceptible movement of her head. No words escaped her lips. "Well then, he sent word he'd meet you at the Riverside Inn, just down the main road there, can't miss it. Yellow building with the green shutters." The man paused, waiting for some response, but Catherine simply adjusted her grip on the satchel and began walking in the direction he'd indicated. Her boots clicked against the wooden boardwalk with a steady rhythm, each step echoing in the afternoon. Quiet. Millbrook was smaller than she'd expected, a collection of weather-beaten buildings strung along a single main street, with the Rocky Mountains rising like ancient sentinels in the distance. The air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, so different from the coal-heavy atmosphere of Pittsburgh she'd left behind. The Riverside Inn stood exactly where the station master had promised, its yellow paint faded but cheerful against the grey September sky. Catherine paused before the front door, her hand hovering over the brass handle. Through the window, she could see the dim outline of tables and chairs, the suggestion of people moving about their daily business. For a moment, something flickered across her features, not quite fear, but a deep wariness that seemed to come from somewhere far beneath the surface. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The main room was larger than it had appeared from the street, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and mismatched furniture scattered throughout. A few local men sat at a corner table, their conversation dying as they noticed the newcomer. Behind the bar, a plump woman with greying hair looked up from polishing glasses. "You must be the bride," the woman said, her voice carrying a note of curiosity rather than judgment. "I'm Martha Crenshaw. I run this place. Mr. Henderson left word you'd be arriving today." Catherine nodded again, the same minimal acknowledgement she'd given the station master. Martha waited, as if expecting her to speak, but when the silence stretched on, she simply gestured toward a table near the window. "Why don't you sit yourself down? I'll fetch you some coffee while you wait. He should be along any minute now." The coffee arrived in a chipped ceramic cup, steam rising from the dark liquid. Catherine wrapped her hands around it, seeking the warmth, but made no move to drink. She stared out the window at the street beyond, watching as a freight wagon rattled past, pulled by two mud-splattered horses. The driver tipped his hat to someone on the sidewalk, calling out a greeting that carried through the glass. Such easy familiarity, such casual connection between people. It seemed as foreign to Catherine as if she were watching actors on a stage. The door opened with a jangling of bells, and a man stepped inside. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair slicked back and clothes that spoke of money, a fine wool coat despite the warm afternoon, polished boots, a gold watch chain glinting across his vest. His eyes swept the room until they found Catherine, and his face broke into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Miss Walsh, I presume." His voice was smooth, cultured, with just a hint of an accent she couldn't place. "Marcus Henderson, I trust your journey wasn't too arduous? Catherine stood, smoothing down her skirts in an automatic gesture. Up close, she could see that Marcus Henderson was perhaps 40 years old, with the kind of confidence that came from never having been. Told no? He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation she placed her own in it. His grip was firm, possessive almost, and he held on just a moment longer than necessary. Not much for conversation, are you? He said, though his tone remained pleasant. No matter. I find that quiet women make the most agreeable wives. Shall we proceed to your new home? I have a carriage waiting outside. The carriage was indeed waiting, a well-appointed vehicle with brass fittings and leather seats. Henderson helped her up with elaborate courtesy, his hand lingering on her elbow as she settled herself on the cushioned bench. As they pulled away from the inn, Catherine caught sight of Martha Crenshaw watching from the window, her expression troubled. The Henderson house sat on a slight rise at the edge of town, a two-story structure of whitewashed wood with green trim and a wraparound porch. It was grander than anything Catherine had expected, speaking of prosperity and position in the community. The grounds were well maintained, with flower beds that had been carefully tended and a white picket fence that gleamed in the afternoon sun. "Impressive, isn't it?" Henderson said as the carriage drew to a stop. "I've worked hard to build something worthy of respect in this territory. A man needs a proper home, a proper wife, to establish his place in society." He spoke of her as if she were another piece of property to be acquired and displayed, but Catherine had grown accustomed to such talk. It was little different from the conversations she'd overheard between her uncle and the various men who'd come calling over the past year, each one examining her like livestock at market. Inside, the house was furnished with the kind of heavy, expensive pieces that proclaimed their owner's wealth without much regard for comfort or beauty. Dark wood and darker fabrics dominated the rooms, creating an atmosphere of oppressive respectability. Henderson gave her a brief tour, pointing out the parlor where she would receive guests, the dining room where she would host his business associates, the kitchen where she would oversee the help. "Your room is upstairs," he said, leading her up a staircase lined with stern-faced portraits. "I trust you'll find it adequate for your needs." The room was large and well-appointed, with a four-poster bed, a mahogany wardrobe, and windows that looked out over the town below. But something about it felt more like a prison cell than a sanctuary. Perhaps it was the heavy curtains that blocked most of the light, or the way the furniture seemed arranged to watch rather than comfort. "We'll be married next Saturday," Henderson continued, settling himself in the room's single chair as if he belonged there. "I've already spoken with Reverend Mills. A simple ceremony, nothing elaborate. I believe in practicality over sentiment." Catherine set her satchel on the bed and began to unpack, her movements methodical and precise. Henderson watched her for a moment, perhaps expecting some response to his announcement, but when none came, he shifted in his chair. "I should mention," he said, his tone becoming slightly more pointed, "that I have certain expectations for my wife. This is a prominent household, and your behavior will reflect on my standing in the community. I trust you understand the importance of propriety." Something in his voice made Catherine's hands still on the dress she was folding. She looked at him for the first time since entering the house, really looked at him, and saw something in his eyes that made her stomach tighten with recognition. It was a look she'd seen before, in another place, another time, a look that suggested ownership, control, the right to demand whatever he pleased. "You seem nervous," Henderson said, rising from his chair and moving closer. "That's understandable. Marriage is a significant step for any woman, but I'm sure you'll adapt quickly to your new circumstances." He reached out as if to touch her face, and Catherine flinched away so sharply that she knocked against the bedpost. The involuntary movement surprised them both. It was the first real reaction she'd shown since arriving in Millbrook. Henderson's expression darkened slightly, but he kept his voice level. "Perhaps you're simply tired from your journey. Rest now, and we'll speak more at dinner. I've arranged for Mrs. Kowalski to prepare something special for your first evening." He left her then, closing the door behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded ominous in the quiet room. Catherine stood frozen for a long moment, her heart beating faster than it had in months. Slowly, she moved to the window and looked down at the street below. In the distance, she could see the train station where she'd arrived just hours ago, and beyond that, the endless expanse of prairie that stretched toward the horizon. For a wild moment, she considered running, gathering her few possessions and fleeing back to that train station, boarding the next eastbound train, regardless of where it might take her. But where would she go? Her uncle had made it clear that she was no longer welcome in his house, not after what had happened. The scandal had made her unmarriageable in Pittsburgh society, damaged goods that needed to be shipped west, where people were less particular about a woman's past. The dinner that followed was a stilted affair. Henderson sat at the head of a dining table that could have seated 12, while Catherine took her place at his right hand. Mrs. Kowalski, a sturdy Polish woman with kind eyes, served courses of beef and potatoes, fresh bread and apple preserves. The food was well prepared, but Catherine could barely taste it. She ate mechanically, responding to Henderson's conversation with nods and occasional murmured agreements. He spoke of his business. He owned the largest lumber mill in the territory, as well as considerable land holdings. He spoke of his plans for expansion, his connections with politicians in Denver, his vision for Millbrook's future. He spoke of everything except her, as if she were simply another piece of furniture to be arranged according to his preferences. "I've taken the liberty of ordering some new dresses for you," he said as Mrs. Kowalski cleared the plates. "Your traveling clothes are serviceable, but hardly appropriate for a woman in my position. The dressmaker will call tomorrow to take your measurements." Catherine looked down at her grey dress. Practical, modest, the sort of thing that drew no attention. It was exactly what she'd wanted when she'd chosen it, clothing that would help her fade into the background, become invisible. But Henderson, it seemed, had different plans for her visibility. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. After dinner, he retired to his study with a brandy and the latest newspapers from Denver, leaving Catherine to explore the house on her own. She wandered through the rooms like a ghost, touching nothing, disturbing nothing. In the parlor, she found a piano, a beautiful instrument of polished rosewood that clearly cost more than most people earned in a year. She lifted the lid and pressed a single key, the note hanging in the air like a question. Once she had played. Once she had filled rooms with music and laughter, had been the sort of person who drew others to her like flowers turning toward the sun. But that was before the party at the Ashfords' mansion, before too much wine and too little supervision, before William Ashford had cornered her in the conservatory while the other guests danced in the ballroom, their music covering the sound of her protests, before she'd fought him off and stumbled back to the party with her dress torn and her hair disheveled, only to have his mother suggest quietly that perhaps she'd had too much to drink and ought to go home. Before the whispers began the next day, whispers that grew into rumors, rumors that hardened into accepted truth. Before her uncle had sat her down in his study and explained, in his cold, precise way, that her reputation was ruined, and her only option was to accept the marriage proposal from Marcus Henderson, a man looking for a wife in the Colorado Territory. "He doesn't know about the incident," her uncle had said, as if assault were merely an unfortunate social blunder. "As long as you conduct yourself properly, there's no reason he ever need know. You'll have a fresh start, Catherine. I suggest you make the most of it. A fresh start, as if she could simply leave her memories behind like an old dress that no longer fit, as if the fear that had settled in her chest like a stone could be discarded with the decision to board a westbound train. Now, standing in Marcus Henderson's parlour with her finger still resting on that single piano key, Catherine felt the weight of her new circumstances settling around her like a heavy cloak. The house was beautiful, well-appointed, respectable. Henderson was wealthy, established, everything her uncle had assured her she could hope for in a husband. But there was something in his eyes, something in the way he looked at her, that echoed too closely the look she'd seen in William Ashford's. Face that terrible night. She closed the piano lid softly and made her way upstairs to her room. Through the thin walls, she could hear Henderson moving around in what she assumed was his bedroom, the creak of floorboards and the soft thud of boots being dropped. Tomorrow, Mrs. Kowalski had told her, she would meet the other women of the town, the wives of Henderson's business associates, the ladies who would form her new social circle. She would smile and nod and say the appropriate things, playing the role of the grateful bride who had found her fortune in the territory. But tonight, she stood at her window, looking out at the unfamiliar landscape, and felt more alone than she ever had in her life. The mountains loomed black against the star-filled sky, beautiful and terrifying in their immensity. Somewhere out there in the darkness, she knew, were people who had come to this place seeking something, freedom, opportunity, a chance to become someone new. She wondered if any of them had found what they were looking for, or if they, like her, had simply traded one kind of prison for another. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp mountain air that seemed to promise endless possibilities. Catherine woke to the sound of hammering from somewhere in the distance, a steady, rhythmic beating that carried across the morning quiet. She dressed in her second-best dress, a dark blue wool that seemed appropriate for meeting the town's ladies, and made her way downstairs to find Henderson already at breakfast. "Sleep well, I trust?" he asked without looking up from his newspaper. "Mrs. Kowalski has prepared quite a spread. I believe in starting the day properly." The table was indeed laden with food, eggs and bacon, fresh biscuits, jam and butter, coffee that filled the room with its rich aroma. Catherine took a small portion of each, more to avoid Henderson's attention than from any real appetite. Outside, that hammering continued, a sound both purposeful and somehow reassuring. "What's that noise?" she asked quietly, the first word she'd spoken since arriving. Henderson glanced up, surprised to hear her voice. "Noise? Oh, that. Blacksmith shop. Fellow named Thomas Burke runs it. Keeps early hours, I'm afraid. You'll get used to it." Say, name meant nothing to her, but something about the steady rhythm of metal on metal seemed to cut through the oppressive quiet of the Henderson house. It spoke of work being done, of things being built or mended, of purpose that extended beyond mere appearance. After breakfast, Henderson departed for his lumber mill, leaving Catherine to await the arrival of the dressmaker and the ladies who would welcome her to Millbrook society. She spent the morning in the parlour, attempting to read a book of improving poetry that Henderson had selected for her, but her attention kept drifting to that window and the sound of the blacksmith's hammer. The dressmaker arrived promptly at 10, a thin, nervous woman named Miss Adelaide, who spoke in rapid bursts while taking Catherine's measurements. She'd brought fabric samples in what she called appropriate colours for a woman in Catherine's position, subdued blues and greys, sensible browns, nothing that might draw undue attention. Catherine submitted to the measuring and pinning with the same passive acceptance she'd shown everything else, though something in her rebelled against the drab practicality of the choices being made for her. At 11, the ladies began to arrive. Mrs. Victoria Caldwell, the banker's wife, swept in first with all the authority of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. She was followed by Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, whose husband owned the general store, and Mrs. Sarah Mitchell, the doctor's wife. They settled themselves in Henderson's parlor like birds claiming territory, their dresses rustling as they arranged themselves on the horsehair sofa and matching chairs. "How wonderful to have another educated woman in our little community," Mrs. Caldwell declared, her voice carrying the particular brand of enthusiasm that suggested duty rather than genuine pleasure. "Mr. Henderson has told us so much about you." Catherine wondered what exactly Henderson had told them, but she simply smiled and murmured her thanks for their welcome. The conversation flowed around her. News of the latest fashions from Denver, gossip about various townspeople, plans for the autumn social events. She was included in the discussion only as an object of curiosity, the mysterious bride who would soon become part of their established social order. "You'll find that we maintain very high standards here in Millbrook," Mrs. Patterson observed, her pale eyes studying Catherine with obvious assessment. "It's so important, don't you think, for the wives of prominent men to set a proper example for the community?" The implication was clear. Catherine was being evaluated, measured against their expectations of what Henderson's wife should be. She nodded appropriately and sipped her tea, playing the role of the grateful newcomer, while internally calculating how many years she might have to endure such gatherings. Through it all, that hammering continued from the direction of the blacksmith's shop, a counterpoint to the careful conversation in Henderson's parlor. Catherine found herself listening for it, using its steady rhythm to anchor herself when the weight of scrutiny became too heavy. There was something honest about that sound, something real in a way that the elaborate politeness surrounding her was not. The ladies departed after precisely 1 hour, having established Catherine's place in their hierarchy and scheduled her for various social obligations in the coming weeks. As their carriage rolled away, Catherine stood at the parlor window, watching the dust settle in their wake. The hammering had stopped, she realized, and the sudden quiet felt almost oppressive after its steady presence throughout the morning. Without quite deciding to do so, she found herself putting on her shawl and stepping out onto the front porch. The air was warmer now, with the sun high overhead and just a hint of autumn in the breeze. From where she stood, she could see most of Millbrook's main street, the general store, the bank, the hotel, and beyond them all, a building with smoke rising from its chimney and the unmistakable silhouette of an anvil visible through the open doorway. She began walking, telling herself she was simply exploring her new town, becoming familiar with the place that would be her home. But her steps carried her steadily toward that building where the hammering had come from, drawn by something she couldn't quite name. The blacksmith shop was a simple structure of weathered wood and stone, built more for function than beauty. The wide doors stood open to let in light and air, and as Catherine approached, she could see the orange glow of the forge fire within. The smell of coal and heated metal grew stronger with each step, not unpleasant but intensely real after the perfumed artificiality of Henderson's house. She paused at the edge of the doorway, suddenly uncertain about her impulse to come here. But before she could retreat, a figure emerged from the depths of the shop. A man perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair damp from heat and sweat and eyes the color of storm clouds. He was wiping his hands on a leather apron, but he stopped when he saw her standing there. "Can I help you, miss?" His voice was quieter than she'd expected, with a gentleness that seemed incongruous with his powerful build and the obvious strength in his arms. Catherine opened her mouth to speak, to explain her presence with some reasonable excuse, but no words came. For the first time in months, she found herself truly looking at another person, not simply registering their existence or evaluating their threat, but actually seeing them. And what she saw in Thomas Burke's eyes was nothing like the calculating assessment she'd grown used to, Nothing like the possessive hunger she'd learned to fear. Instead, she saw simple kindness, and the shock of it left her speechless. Thomas Burke studied the woman standing at the edge of his shop with the careful attention he usually reserved for examining a piece of metal for flaws. She was clearly not from Millbrook. Her dress was too fine, her posture too refined for a frontier town. But it wasn't her obvious gentility that caught his attention. It was the way she held herself, as if braced against an invisible wind that might knock her down at any moment. "I'm sorry," Catherine finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to disturb your work." "No disturbance," Thomas replied, setting down the horseshoe he'd been shaping. "Were you looking for something in particular? A repair, perhaps?" Catherine shook her head, then seemed to remember her manners. "I'm Catherine Walsh. I've just arrived in town to marry Mr. Henderson." Thomas nodded slowly. He'd heard about Henderson's mail-order bride, though the news had stirred less interest in him than in most of the townspeople. Marcus Henderson wasn't a man he particularly liked or trusted, but that was Henderson's business, not his. "Thomas Burke," he said simply. "Welcome to Millbrook." An awkward silence stretched between them. Catherine seemed on the verge of leaving, but something kept her rooted to the spot. Perhaps it was the workshop itself, the honest disorder of tools and projects, the purposeful arrangement of anvil and forge, the sense that real work happened here rather than the careful performance of respectability she'd encountered elsewhere. "What were you making?" she asked suddenly, nodding toward the half-finished horseshoe on his workbench. "Shoes for Mayor Patterson's gelding. Beast throws shoes like he's trying to rid himself of unwanted baggage." Thomas picked up the iron piece, turning it in his hands. "Horse has spirit, though. Can't fault him for that." Something flickered across Catherine's features. Not quite a smile, but the shadow of what a smile might have been in someone who still remembered how to make them. Thomas noticed it and filed the observation away, the way he might note a promising vein in a piece of raw ore. "I used to watch the farrier at my uncle's estate," Catherine said, surprising herself by speaking. "He said a good horseshoe could mean the difference between a safe journey and disaster. Your uncle kept horses. A few. Nothing grand, but he believed in proper maintenance." She paused, seeming to realize how much she'd revealed. "I should return. Mr. Henderson will be expecting me for lunch." But she didn't move, and Thomas found himself reluctant to see her go. There was something about her stillness that spoke to him, not the peaceful quiet of contentment, but the terrible stillness of someone who had learned that moving too quickly, speaking too freely, could bring unwanted attention. "You're welcome to watch if you'd like," he heard himself say. "Not much excitement in it, but some find the work interesting." Catherine's eyes widened slightly, as if the simple invitation was more kindness than she'd expected to receive. After a moment's hesitation, she stepped just inside the doorway, staying well clear of the forge, but close enough to observe. Thomas returned to his work, heating the iron until it glowed cherry red, then shaping it with careful strikes of his hammer. He was acutely aware of her presence, but he didn't rush or show off. Instead, he worked with the same steady precision he always employed, letting the rhythm of metal on metal fill the space between them. "The sparks don't frighten you?" Catherine asked, as a shower of bright fragments danced away from the anvil. "They're part of the process. Fire shapes the metal, but it destroys what's weak. The trick is knowing how much heat to apply, and when." He glanced at her briefly. "Too little, and nothing changes. Too much, and you ruin the piece entirely." Catherine absorbed this in silence, but Thomas sensed she was thinking about more than metalwork. He finished shaping the shoe and set it aside to cool, then began organizing his tools with the methodical care of someone who understood that order made the difference between efficiency and chaos. "Your hands," Catherine observed quietly. "They're scarred, Thomas looked down at his calloused palms, marked with small burns and old cuts that were the inevitable price of his trade. Occupational hazard. Hot metal doesn't forgive carelessness. Do they hurt? Not anymore. Skin toughens up. After a while, he studied her face, noting the way she seemed to be cataloguing each mark. Pain has a way of teaching lessons nothing else can. The words hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than a simple discussion of blacksmithing injuries. Catherine's fingers unconsciously moved to her throat, where the high collar of her dress concealed what Thomas suspected might be marks of a different kind entirely. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted the moment. Marcus Henderson appeared in the doorway, his expensive clothes looking out of place against the rough-hewn backdrop of the shop. His expression was pleasant enough, but his eyes held a sharpness that Thomas recognized, the look of a man who considered everything in his vicinity to be his property. "Catherine, my dear, I've been looking for you." Henderson's voice carried just enough reproach to make his displeasure clear, without seeming unreasonable to an observer. "Mrs. Kowalski has prepared lunch, and I dislike keeping proper meals waiting." "Of course," Catherine replied, her voice immediately becoming smaller, more subdued. "I was just exploring the town, naturally. Quite understandable." Henderson's smile never wavered as he turned to Thomas. "Burke, isn't it? I trust my bride hasn't been interfering with your work." "No interference," Thomas said evenly. "Just conversation." "How nice." Henderson placed his hand on Catherine's elbow, a gesture that appeared protective, but carried an unmistakable sense of possession. "Come along, my dear. We have much to discuss regarding Saturday's ceremony." Catherine nodded and allowed herself to be guided away, but she glanced back once as they reached the street. Thomas caught her eye and nodded slightly, a small acknowledgement that seemed to steady her somehow. After they disappeared from view, Thomas remained standing in his doorway for several minutes, staring at the empty street. He'd seen enough of the world to recognize the signs, the way Catherine had flinched when Henderson touched her, the careful way she measured her words, the haunted quality in her eyes that spoke of experiences no one should have to endure. He'd also seen the brief moment when something else had flickered across her features, curiosity, perhaps, or the ghost of who she might have been before whatever had happened to steal her laughter. It was none of his business, he told himself as he returned to work. Marcus Henderson was a prominent man in town, and Catherine Walsh had chosen to marry him. Whatever arrangement they'd made between them was their affair. But as he heated another piece of iron and began shaping it against the anvil, Thomas found his thoughts returning to the woman with the careful hands and the broken spirit. He'd spent years learning to read metal, to understand what it could become with the right application of heat and pressure. Reading people, he was discovering, required similar skills. The next morning brought unseasonably warm weather, and Thomas had both doors of his shop open to catch any available breeze. He was working on a set of hinges for the new schoolhouse when he heard voices from the street, a man's raised tone, followed by a woman's quieter response. Through the open doorway, he could see Henderson standing beside his carriage, apparently having words with Catherine. "I specifically told you to wear the blue dress today," Henderson was saying, his voice carrying the particular edge of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "Mrs. Caldwell expects a certain level of presentation at these gatherings." "I thought the grey was more appropriate for visiting the sick," Catherine replied, her words barely audible from where Thomas stood. "What's appropriate is whatever I tell you is appropriate." Henderson's tone had grown sharper. "Mrs. Patterson is recovering from a minor ailment, not dying of consumption. The blue dress projects the proper image of prosperity and refinement." Catherine bowed her head in submission, and Thomas felt his jaw tighten involuntarily. He'd witnessed similar scenes before, Men who mistook dominance for leadership, who believed that marriage gave them the right to dictate every aspect of their wives' existence. Usually, he minded his own business. Usually, it wasn't his concern. But something about the defeated slope of Catherine's shoulders stirred an anger in him that he hadn't felt in years. Without fully considering his actions, he stepped out of his shop and approached the couple. "Morning, Henderson," he said pleasantly. "Fine day for visiting the sick." Henderson turned, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "Burke, yes, quite fine. We were just discussing the proper attire for social calls." "Seemed more like a lecture than a discussion," Thomas observed mildly. He glanced at Catherine, noting the flush of embarrassment on her cheeks. Mrs. Patterson always appreciated practical consideration over fashion, from what I recall. "I hardly think a blacksmith is qualified to comment on matters of social propriety," Henderson replied, his voice cooling noticeably. "Perhaps not. But I know kindness when I see it, and Mrs. Patterson values that above fine dresses." Thomas's tone remained conversational, but something in his stance suggested he wasn't planning to back down. "Grey seems like a thoughtful choice for someone who's been feeling poorly." The tension stretched between the two men, while Catherine stood frozen between them, clearly mortified to be the center of such attention. Finally, Henderson forced his smile back into place. "Of course, you're quite right. Catherine shows admirable consideration for others' comfort." His hand found her elbow again, the grip perhaps a little tighter than necessary. "We should be going. Good day, Burke." As the carriage rolled away, Thomas caught sight of Catherine looking back through the rear window. Her expression was unreadable, but he thought he detected something that might have been gratitude mixed with fear. The intervention had been well-intentioned, but he suspected it might have made things more difficult for her once they were alone. The realization troubled him more than it should have. He barely knew the woman, and her situation was hardly unique. Frontier towns were full of marriages based on convenience rather than affection, arrangements that prioritized survival over sentiment. But there had been something in Catherine's eyes that suggested her circumstances went beyond mere lovelessness into something darker. That afternoon, as Thomas was finishing his work for the day, he noticed a commotion near the general store. A small crowd had gathered around what appeared to be an overturned wagon, its contents scattered across the dusty street. He wiped his hands and walked over to investigate. The wagon belonged to Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, a widow who lived alone. On a small farm outside town, she was kneeling beside the wreckage, trying to salvage what appeared to be weeks' worth of carefully preserved vegetables and fruits. Her face was streaked with tears of frustration as she surveyed the damage. "Damn wheel bearing gave out completely," explained Jim Morrison, who owned the livery stable. "Nothing anyone could have done. These old wagons just wear out eventually." Thomas knelt beside Mrs. Hartwell, helping her gather the scattered produce. Much of it was bruised but still salvageable, though her winter's food supply had clearly taken a serious blow. "I can fix the wagon," he told her quietly. "Won't take more than a day or two." "I can't afford to pay for repairs," Mrs. Hartwell replied, her voice thick with embarrassment. "Not until I sell the apple crop, anyway." "Didn't ask for payment." "Sometimes neighbors help neighbors because it's the right thing to do." As they worked to salvage what they could, Thomas became aware of another figure kneeling beside them. Catherine had apparently been passing by when the accident occurred, and she was carefully sorting the damaged produce from what could still be used. Her grey dress, the one Henderson had criticized, was already dusty from her efforts, but she seemed unconcerned about appearances. "These pears are just bruised," she said, showing Mrs. Hartwell a basket full of slightly damaged fruit. "If you cook them down with a little sugar, they'll make excellent preserves." "You know about preserving?" Mrs. Hartwell asked, surprised. "A little. My mother taught me before she passed. Catherine's voice carried a note of old grief, but also something warmer, the memory of better times. "If you'd like, I could help. You prepare them. It's easier with two people." Mrs. Hartwell's relief was evident. "Oh, my dear, that would be such a blessing. I've been dreading the thought of losing so much food." As the three of them worked together to load the salvageable produce into baskets, Thomas found himself stealing glances at Catherine. Away from Henderson's watchful presence, she seemed different, more present, more genuinely engaged with the world around her. Her movements were still careful, but they carried a hint of the competence and kindness that must have existed before whatever had damaged her spirit. "You have gentle hands," Mrs. Hartwell observed, as Catherine carefully wrapped the more delicate items, perfect for preserving work. Catherine's cheeks colored slightly at the compliment. "I enjoy working with my hands. It feels productive." "Not many ladies of your station would think so," Thomas said, then immediately regretted the comment when Catherine's expression shuttered again. "I'm not a lady of any particular station," she replied quietly, "just someone trying to be useful." The sadness in her voice caught Thomas off guard. Here was a woman who clearly came from money and education, engaged to one of the wealthiest men in the territory, yet she spoke as if she believed herself to be worthless. What kind of experiences, he wondered, could strip someone of such basic self-worth? By the time they'd finished clearing the street, the sun was beginning to set. Mrs. Hartwell insisted on thanking them both profusely, though Catherine seemed embarrassed by the gratitude. As the older woman climbed into Jim Morrison's wagon for a ride home, she called back to Catherine, "Don't forget, tomorrow morning at 8, and bring an apron, dear. Preserving can be messy work." Catherine waved acknowledgement, and for just a moment Thomas caught a glimpse of what might have been anticipation on her face. It was gone so quickly he might have imagined it, but it left him with an odd sense of hope. "That was kind of you," he said, as they stood alone on the now empty street. "Offering to help, I mean." Mrs. Hartwell needed assistance. It seemed natural to offer. Catherine adjusted her shawl, preparing to leave. "Thank you for defending my choice of dress earlier. It wasn't necessary, but it was appreciated." Before Thomas could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted the moment. Henderson's carriage appeared around the corner, moving faster than was safe for the crowded street. It pulled up beside them with a sharp jerk that spoke of the driver's impatience. "Catherine!" Henderson's voice carried a note of barely controlled anger. "I've been searching the entire town for you. Where have you been?" "There was an accident," Catherine replied, her voice immediately becoming smaller. "Mrs. Hartwell's wagon overturned and I was helping. You were supposed to return home after visiting Mrs. Patterson. That was hours ago." Henderson's eyes flicked to Thomas, clearly displeased to find his bride in the company of the blacksmith again. "Get in the carriage, now." Catherine climbed into the vehicle without another word, but Thomas stepped forward before Henderson could drive away. "Mrs. Hartwell lost most of her winter stores in that accident," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Your bride offered to help her preserve what could be salvaged. It was a generous gesture." Henderson's expression suggested he cared. Nothing for Mrs. Hartwell's circumstances or Catherine's generosity. "My bride has obligations that don't include manual labor on public streets. Good evening, Burke." As the carriage rolled away, Thomas caught one last glimpse of Catherine through the rear window. This time, her expression was clear enough to read gratitude mixed with resignation, as if she was already calculating the price she would pay for those few hours of feeling useful and needed. Standing alone in the gathering dusk, Thomas made a decision that surprised him with its certainty. Tomorrow morning, he would find an excuse to be near Mrs. Hartwell's house, not to interfere. He wasn't fool enough to think he could solve Catherine's problems, but simply to ensure that she had at least one person nearby who understood that her kindness was worthy of protection. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of mountain air that made everything seem possible. Thomas finished his early chores and set out for Mrs. Hartwell's farm, carrying his tools and the materials needed to repair her wagon. He told himself it was simple neighborliness, nothing more. He arrived to find Catherine already at work in Mrs. Hartwell's kitchen, her sleeves rolled up and her hair pinned back practically. She wore a simple brown dress he hadn't seen before, and over it a well-worn apron that had clearly seen years of honest use. For the first time since he'd met her, she looked like she belonged exactly where she was. "Mr. Burke," Mrs. Hartwell called from the doorway. "Perfect timing. The wagon's behind the barn, and I've got coffee on the stove if you'd like some." As Thomas worked on the broken wheel bearing, he could hear voices drifting from the kitchen. Mrs. Hartwell's cheerful chatter and Catherine's quieter responses. But gradually, as the morning wore on, Catherine's voice grew stronger, more animated. She was describing some technique her mother had taught her, and there was something in her tone that Thomas hadn't heard before. The sound of someone remembering who they used to be. When he finished the repair and went inside for that promised coffee, he found the kitchen filled with the rich scent of cooking fruit and the warm atmosphere of women working together toward a common goal. Catherine looked up from the pot she was stirring, and for just an instant he saw something that might have been the beginning of a smile. It wasn't much, barely a softening around her eyes, a slight upward curve at the corners of her mouth. But it was more expression than he'd seen from her since the day they'd met, and it filled him with an unexpected sense of accomplishment, as if he'd successfully shaped a particularly difficult piece of metal. "The preserves are nearly finished," she said, her voice carrying a note of quiet pride. "Mrs. Hartwell won't lose her winter stores after all." "Thanks to you," Thomas replied, accepting a cup of coffee from their hostess. "She's lucky you were there to help." Catherine's almost smile faded slightly, replaced by the more familiar expression of someone who didn't quite believe in their own worth. But the moment had existed, however briefly, and Thomas found himself determined to see it again. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the mountains, promising the first real weather of the season. Inside Mrs. Hartwell's kitchen, 3 people worked together in comfortable companionship, and for a little while, the world felt like a place where kindness still mattered and broken things could be mended. Thomas stayed longer than he'd intended, helping to carry the finished preserves to the cellar and ensuring that the repaired wagon was properly secured. As the afternoon wore on, he noticed that Catherine seemed reluctant to leave, finding small tasks to extend her time away from town. When Mrs. Hartwell finally suggested they should probably head back before the weather turned, Catherine's face fell in a way that spoke volumes about her feelings toward her temporary home. "Thank you," she said to Mrs. Hartwell as they prepared to part ways, "for letting me help, for treating me like someone useful." "Oh, my dear," Mrs. Hartwell replied, pulling Catherine into a warm embrace. "You are useful. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." As Thomas drove Catherine back to town in his own wagon, she sat quietly beside him, lost in thought. The approaching storm had brought an early twilight, and the first fat raindrops were beginning to fall as they reached the main street. "He'll be angry," Catherine said suddenly, so quietly Thomas almost missed it over the sound of approaching thunder. "About the time. About everything. About me helping with manual labor. About spending the day away from the house. About—" She trailed off, seeming to realize how much she was revealing. Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop in front of Henderson's house, but he made no move to help her down immediately. Instead, he turned to face her, his expression serious but kind. "What you did today, helping Mrs. Hartwell, showing kindness to someone who needed it, that was good work. Important work. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Catherine stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to memorize his words. Then, without speaking, she climbed down from the wagon and hurried up the front walk. Thomas watched until she disappeared inside, then drove slowly back to his shop, the sound of her almost smile echoing in his memory like the ring of a hammer on an anvil. Inside the Henderson house, Catherine stood in the front hall, listening to the sound of Marcus's footsteps as he approached from his study. The brief joy of the day was already fading, replaced by the familiar weight of apprehension. But somewhere, deep inside, in a place that had been dark for too long, something small and stubborn had begun to glow, like a piece of iron in the forge, heated just enough to begin changing shape. The storm that had threatened the previous evening arrived with full force during the night, bringing driving rain and wind that rattled the windows of every building in Millbrook. Catherine lay awake listening to it, finding strange comfort in the wild sounds after the tense silence that had followed her return home. Henderson's displeasure had been evident in every clipped word, every calculated pause, but he had stopped short of direct confrontation. Perhaps even he understood that punishing her for an act of Christian charity would reflect poorly on his standing in the community. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the air clean and sharp with the scent of wet pine. Catherine dressed carefully in one of her older dresses, nothing that Henderson might find objectionable, but practical enough for the errands she hoped to accomplish. Mrs. Kowalski had mentioned that several items needed attention from the seamstress, and Catherine had volunteered to handle the deliveries herself. The truth was, she craved any excuse to leave the oppressive atmosphere of Henderson's house. The walls seemed to close in on her more each day, filled as they were with his expectations and silent judgments. Even the finest furnishings couldn't disguise the feeling that she was living in an elegant prison. Main Street showed evidence of the storm's passage, puddles reflecting the morning sky and debris scattered by the wind. Catherine picked her way carefully along the boardwalk, her basket of mending balanced on her arm. She'd already visited the post office and the general store, savoring these brief interactions with people who had no investment in molding her into Marcus Henderson's ideal wife. As she approached the blacksmith shop, she found herself slowing, drawn by the familiar sound of hammer on metal. Thomas Burke stood at his anvil, working on what appeared to be a set of decorative ironwork, scrolled pieces that would likely grace someone's front gate. His concentration was complete, each strike precise and purposeful, and Catherine found herself mesmerized by the rhythm of creation. Admiring craftsmanship, Catherine startled, turning to find Dr. Samuel Mitchell approaching with his medical bag in hand. He was a kind-faced man in his 50s, with the sort of gentle demeanor that put patients at ease. "I was just." "The work is beautiful," Catherine managed, heat rising in her cheeks at being caught staring. "Thomas does fine ironwork. Best in the territory, I'd say. He made the weather vane for our house, a ship in full sail. My wife still stops to admire it every time she tends her garden." Dr. Mitchell studied Catherine with the assessing gaze of someone accustomed to reading beyond surface appearances. "You're Mrs. Henderson-to-be, aren't you? Sarah mentioned meeting you at the ladies' gathering." "Yes, Catherine Walsh." She shifted her basket, suddenly conscious of appearing idle. "I was just running errands." Admirable. Too many folks think errands are beneath them once they achieve a certain station. Oh, there was something pointed in his observation, though his tone remained pleasant. "Speaking of which, I should check on Mrs. Hartwell. Heard she had quite an adventure yesterday with that wagon." Catherine's pulse quickened. "Is she injured?" "I helped her with the preserving, but she seemed well enough then. Nothing serious, just some strained muscles from all that lifting and cleaning," though she couldn't stop praising the young lady who spent her entire day helping a near stranger in need. Dr. Mitchell's smile was warm. "Acts of genuine kindness are rarer than they should be, Miss Walsh. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Before Catherine could respond, Thomas emerged from his shop, wiping sweat from his brow with a rag. He nodded politely to Dr. Mitchell, then his gaze found Catherine's face. "Miss Walsh, out early this morning." "Errands," she replied, lifting her basket slightly. "And you're working on something beautiful, from what I could see." Thomas glanced back at his anvil, where the ironwork lay cooling. "Garden gate for the new banker who's moving up from Denver. Want something to announce his arrival, apparently." Dr. Mitchell chuckled. "Nothing wrong with a man taking pride in his home, though I suppose there's a difference between pride and vanity." He tipped his hat to Catherine. "I should be on my way. Good day to you both." As the doctor's footsteps faded, an awkward silence settled between Catherine and Thomas. She knew she should continue on her errands, return to Henderson's house before her absence was noted. But something kept her feet planted on the wooden walkway. "Would you like to see the work up close?" Thomas asked quietly. "I mean, if you're interested in the craft." Catherine glanced around, ensuring they wouldn't be observed, then nodded. Thomas led her into the shop, where the morning light filtering through the open doors illuminated his workspace. The ironwork was even more impressive at close range, delicate scrolls and leaves that seemed to flow like water despite being forged from solid metal. "How do you make it look so alive?" Catherine asked, running her finger just above the surface, not quite touching. "Metal has its own nature. Force it too hard, and it breaks. Work with its properties, and it becomes something beautiful." Thomas picked up one of the finished pieces, turning it so the light caught the subtle textures. "This iron started as rough stock, nothing special, but with enough heat and patience, it transforms." Catherine's voice was thoughtful. "Do you think that's possible for anything or anyone?" Thomas set down the ironwork and looked at her directly. "I think most things can change, given the right conditions. The question is whether they want to." The weight of his words settled between them. Catherine found herself studying his hands, scarred but strong, capable of both power and delicacy. There was something reassuring about their steadiness, so different from the calculating gestures she'd grown accustomed to. "I should go," she said suddenly, the spell of the moment breaking. "My errands, of course." Thomas stepped back, giving her space. "Perhaps you'd like to see the finished gate when it's done. Should be ready by week's end." Catherine paused, at the threshold. "I'd like that very much." The admission surprised them both. Catherine hurried away before she could say anything else that might be misconstrued, but she carried with her the memory of Thomas's careful attention, the way he'd explained his craft as if her understanding mattered. The rest of her errands passed in a blur. She delivered the mending to Mrs. Patterson, picked up a thread from the mercantile, and stopped by the post office to mail a brief letter to her former neighbor in Pittsburgh, a careful, cheerful note that revealed nothing of her actual circumstances. By the time she returned to Henderson's house, the morning was well advanced, and her absence had been noted. "There you are," Henderson said as she entered the front hall. He was dressed for business, his gold watch chain glinting across his vest. "I was beginning to wonder if you'd gotten lost." "Just errands," Catherine replied, setting down her basket. "Mrs. Patterson's alterations, thread from the store, posting a letter." "A letter to whom?" The question was asked casually, but Catherine recognized the sharp interest beneath the pleasant tone. "Mrs. Abernathy, my uncle's neighbor. She asked me to write when I arrived safely." Henderson nodded, apparently satisfied. "In the future, I'd prefer you inform Mrs. Kowalski of your plans before leaving the house. A woman in your position shouldn't wander about unescorted." "Of course." Catherine kept her voice level, though something in her chest tightened at the implication. "I'll remember that." "Good. I have business in Denver for the next 3 days. Meetings with some investors about expanding the lumber operation. You'll remain here naturally. Mrs. Kowalski will ensure you have everything you need." Relief flooded through Catherine, though she was careful not to let it show. 3 days without Henderson's watchful presence, 3 days when she could move, about without constant evaluation and correction. "I understand," she said simply. Henderson studied her for a moment as if searching for some sign of discontent or rebellion. Finding none, he nodded curtly. The carriage will collect me within the hour. I trust you'll use the time productively, perhaps working on your needlework skills. A man in my position requires a wife who can contribute to proper entertaining. After he left, the house seemed to exhale, settling into a more natural rhythm. Mrs. Kowalski emerged from the kitchen with a smile that had been notably absent when Henderson was present. "Well now, miss, it'll be nice to have some peace and quiet for a few days. That man does love the sound of his own voice, doesn't he?" Catherine blinked in surprise. She'd assumed Mrs. Kowalski was completely loyal to her employer, but the Polish woman's knowing expression suggested otherwise. "I shouldn't speak ill of Mr. Henderson," Catherine said carefully. "Shouldn't and don't need to are different things entirely." Mrs. Kowalski bustled about, straightening cushions that were already perfectly arranged. "Man thinks he knows everything, but he don't know the first thing about running a proper household. Been telling me how to cook for 20 years, and he still don't know the difference between a roux and a reduction." This glimpse of irreverence was so unexpected that Catherine felt something loosen in her chest, not quite laughter, but the precursor to it. Mrs. Kowalski noticed immediately. "There now, that's better. You got too serious a face for such a young woman. Life's hard enough without borrowing trouble from tomorrow." The next morning, Catherine woke with an unfamiliar sense of possibility. Henderson was gone. The house was quiet, and the autumn day stretched before her like an empty canvas. She dressed in her plainest dress and made her way to the kitchen, where Mrs. Kowalski was preparing breakfast. "Sleep well, did you?" the older woman asked, cracking eggs into a skillet. "Better than I have in weeks," Catherine admitted. "Mrs. Kowalski, would it be terribly improper if I took a walk this morning, just around town, nothing elaborate?" "Improper? Lord Child, walking is what legs are for. Mr. Henderson's not here to fuss about propriety, and what he don't know won't hurt him." Mrs. Kowalski winked conspiratorially. "Take your time. I'll keep some coffee warm for when you return." The morning air was crisp and clean, washed by the recent storm. Catherine walked slowly through Millbrook's quiet streets, observing details she'd missed during her more hurried errands. The way morning light caught the weathered wood of the buildings, the sound of children's laughter from the schoolyard, the comfortable rhythm of a town going about its daily business. She found herself drawn, almost without conscious thought, toward the blacksmith shop. From a distance, she could see Thomas working in the yard beside his building, fitting new shoes to a patient bay mare. The horse stood quietly, occasionally shifting its weight, but clearly trusting the man who held its hoof. "Easy there, lady," Thomas murmured, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Just making sure you're properly shod for the road ahead." Catherine moved closer, fascinated by the gentleness with which he handled the large animal. She'd seen farriers work before, but never with such obvious care for the horse's comfort. "She's beautiful," Catherine said softly, not wanting to startle either horse or man. Thomas looked up, surprise flickering across his features before settling into something warmer. "Miss Walsh, out for a morning constitutional." Something like, "Oh, that." Catherine approached slowly, extending her hand for the mare to investigate. "What's her name?" "This is Belle. Belongs to Mrs. Crawford, the schoolteacher. Finest manners of any horse in the territory." Thomas finished securing the shoe and lowered Belle's hoof gently. "There you go, girl. Good as new." Belle turned her head toward Catherine, blowing softly through her nostrils. Without thinking, Catherine reached up to stroke the smooth neck, and the mare leaned into the touch with obvious pleasure. "She likes you," Thomas observed. "Horses are good judges of character." "Are they?" Catherine continued stroking Belle's neck, finding comfort in the simple, honest connection. "I used to ride before my circumstances changed. There's something peaceful about horses, isn't there? They don't judge or demand explanations." just honesty. They can sense pretense from a mile away. Thomas began cleaning his tools, but his attention remained on Catherine and the mare. "Do you miss it? Riding?" "Every day." The admission slipped out before Catherine could stop it. "There was a grey gelding at my uncle's estate, Thunder. Silly name for such a gentle creature, but he had the smoothest gaits. Sometimes I'd ride, out early in the morning before the house stirred, and for those few hours I could pretend I was anyone, going anywhere." Something in her voice must have betrayed more than she intended, because Thomas paused in his work to study her face. "What stopped you?" Catherine's hand stilled on Belle's neck. How could she explain the series of events that had stripped away, not just her freedom to ride, but her freedom to be herself? The scandal, the whispers, the gradual erosion of every simple pleasure until all that remained was the prospect of marriage to a man who valued her only as an ornament for his carefully constructed life. "Life," she said finally. "Life stopped." "Me?" Thomas nodded, as if he understood that some explanations were too heavy for casual conversation. "Belle needs exercise beyond what Mrs. Crawford can provide. If you'd ever like to take her out, I'm sure she'd appreciate the company." Catherine's heart leaped at the suggestion, but reality quickly reasserted itself. "I couldn't. Mr. Henderson wouldn't approve, and I don't have proper riding attire, and—" "Henderson's not here," Thomas pointed out mildly, "and Belle doesn't care what you're wearing. She just wants someone who'll treat her with respect." The parallel wasn't lost on Catherine. She looked into Belle's large, intelligent eyes and saw something that had become foreign to her. Acceptance without judgment, companionship without demands. "I shouldn't," she whispered, but her resolve was already weakening. "Shouldn't is just another word for being afraid to live," Thomas said quietly. "Sometimes we have to choose between what we should do and what we need to do." Catherine stood frozen between longing and propriety, between the safe, suffocating path laid out for her and the wild possibility of reclaiming something she'd thought lost forever. Belle shifted restlessly, sensing the conflict and the movement. Decided her. "Just a short ride," she said, her voice barely audible. "Just to the edge of town and back." Thomas's smile was like the sunrise. "I'll saddle her up." 20 minutes later, Catherine sat astride Belle, with a feeling that was part terror, part exhilaration. She'd managed to mount from the wooden block behind Thomas's shop, and though her long skirts were hardly ideal for riding, they would suffice. "For a gentle hack, remember," Thomas said, adjusting the stirrups to accommodate her shorter legs. "Belle knows these trails better than most people. Trust her judgment, and she'll take care of you." Catherine gathered the reins with hands that remembered their purpose, and Belle responded immediately to the familiar signals. They walked quietly out of the yard and onto the path that led toward the mountains, the mare's steady rhythm gradually easing Catherine's nervous tension. As they moved away from the buildings and into the open country beyond Millbrook, Catherine felt something shift inside her, a loosening of the tight control she'd maintained over every thought and feeling. Here, with no one to observe or judge, she could simply be present in the moment. The sun on her face, the creak of leather, the comfortable sway of Belle's movement beneath her, for the first time in longer than she could remember. Catherine felt the corners of her mouth curve upward, not quite a smile, but the possibility of one. Belle's ears flicked back as if sensing her rider's changing mood, and the mare's pace quickened slightly, eager to extend their adventure. They rode for perhaps an hour, following trails that wound through stands of aspen and pine, with glimpses of snow-capped peaks in the distance. Catherine found herself talking to Belle, describing the landscape, sharing memories of rides taken in happier times, voicing thoughts she'd kept locked away for months. "I used to think I knew who I was," she confided to the horse's alert ears. "Had such plans, such certainty about what my life would become. Seems foolish now, but I believed in goodness then. believed that decent behavior would be rewarded, that kindness mattered, that the world made sense. Belle nickered softly, as if in sympathy, and Catherine reached forward to pat her neck. Then William Ashford proved me wrong about everything, not just about him, but about myself, about how little control any of us really have over our circumstances. The words came easier than they had to any human being. Sometimes I wonder if I deserved what happened, if I somehow invited his attention, encouraged his assumptions. The confession hung in the mountain air, carried away by the wind that whispered through the trees. Belle continued her steady pace, patient and non-judgmental, and gradually Catherine felt some of the poison drain from the wound she'd been carrying. When they finally turned back toward town, Catherine was reluctant to end the interlude. But reality was waiting, along with the responsibilities and restrictions that defined her current existence. As Millbrook came into view, she could see Thomas standing outside his shop, obviously watching for their return. She behaved perfectly, Catherine reported as she dismounted, somewhat awkwardly but successfully. Not a single misstep. I never doubted it. Belle's a lady. Thomas took the reins, but his attention remained on Catherine's face. Did it help? The ride? Catherine considered the question seriously. Something had changed during their hour in, the mountains. Not healing exactly, but perhaps the beginning of it. The tight knot of fear and shame that had lived in her chest for months felt looser somehow, as if Belle's steady gait had shaken something free. Yes, she said simply. It helped. Thomas nodded, as if he'd expected no less. Belle could use regular exercise. If you'd like to take her out again while Henderson's away. I would, Catherine replied before prudence could stop her. I would like that very much. As she walked back toward Henderson's house, Catherine carried with her the memory of wind in her face and the feeling of moving forward under her own power. It wasn't much, just an hour of borrowed freedom on a borrowed horse, but it was more hope than she'd felt in longer than she could remember. That evening, Mrs. Kowalski served dinner in the kitchen rather than the formal dining room, and they ate together like conspirators, trading stories and observations about Millbrook's residence. Catherine found herself laughing, actually laughing, at Mrs. Kowalski's imitation of the mayor's pompous speaking style. "Lord, it's good to hear that sound," Mrs. Kowalski said, her eyes twinkling. "Been wondering if you remembered how?" Catherine's laughter faded slightly. "I'd almost forgotten myself." "Well, don't forget again. Life's too short to spend it all looking serious." Mrs. Kowalski began clearing the dishes. "Mr. Henderson don't appreciate levity, I know, but there's no law that says you can't find joy when he's not around to disapprove." That night, Catherine fell asleep, thinking not of her upcoming wedding or the restrictions that would soon define her existence, but of Belle's steady gait and Thomas Burke's understanding eyes. For the first time in months, her dreams were not haunted by shadows from the past, but filled with mountain trails and the promise of tomorrow's ride. The second day of Henderson's absence dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline air that made everything seem possible. Catherine woke early, dressed quickly, and made her way to the kitchen where Mrs. Kowalski was already preparing breakfast. "Another constitutional planned?" the older woman asked with a knowing smile. "Perhaps. A longer one today," Catherine admitted. "The fresh air seems to agree with me." "That it does. You've got color in your cheeks for the first time since you arrived. Fresh air and exercise are better medicine than anything Dr. Mitchell keeps in his bag." Catherine made her way to the blacksmith shop with a lightness in her step that felt foreign but welcome. She found Thomas shoeing a different horse, a spirited chestnut that required more patience than Belle had shown. "Steady there, Jupiter," Thomas murmured to the fidgeting animal. "No one's trying to hurt you." "Difficult customer?" Catherine asked, keeping her distance from the nervous horse. just young and full of energy. Reminds me of myself at that age, too. Much spirit and not enough sense. Thomas finished the shoe and straightened, wiping his hands on his apron. Bell's ready when you are, if you're planning another ride. I was hoping, that is, if it wouldn't be too much trouble. Catherine found herself suddenly shy, as if asking for this simple pleasure was an enormous imposition. No trouble at all. In fact, I was thinking I might join you today if you wouldn't mind the company. Got a delivery to make to a ranch about 5 miles out, and Belle could use a companion for the journey. The prospect of riding with Thomas should have alarmed her. Certainly Henderson would have been scandalized by such impropriety. But Catherine found herself nodding eagerly, hungry for any extension of her newfound freedom. "I'd like that," she said, then blushed at her own enthusiasm. "I mean, if it's truly no inconvenience." "None at all. Let me finish with Jupiter here, and we'll be on our way." An hour later, they rode out of Millbrook together. Catherine on Belle, Thomas on a sturdy brown gelding named Rusty. The morning was perfect for riding, with enough coolness to keep the horses fresh and enough sun to warm their faces. Catherine felt herself relaxing into Belle's rhythm, her confidence growing with each mile. "Tell me about your work," she said, as they followed a well-worn trail through a grove of golden aspen. "How did you become a blacksmith?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. "Started as an apprentice back in Ohio when I was 14. My father was a farmer, but he could see I had more interest in making things than growing them. Blacksmith in our town needed help, and I needed to learn a trade. Did you always want to come west?" "Not at first, but after the war." Thomas's voice trailed off, and Catherine sensed painful memories beneath the surface. "Let's just say I needed a fresh start. Colorado Territory seemed like a good place to disappear and start over." Catherine understood the impulse to disappear, to shed an unwanted past like a snake shedding skin. "And have you? Started over, I mean?" Thomas glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "Still working on it. Some things are harder to leave behind than others." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, following the trail as it wound higher into the foothills. The air grew thinner and cleaner, carrying the scent of pine and the distant sound of running water. Catherine found herself studying Thomas's profile, noting the way he sat his horse with easy confidence, the gentle way his hands held the reins. "What about you?" Thomas asked eventually. "What was your life like before?" The question she'd been dreading, asked so simply that she almost answered without thinking, almost told him about the music lessons and the garden parties, the careful cultivation of accomplishments deemed appropriate for a young lady of good family, almost described the gradual narrowing of her world after her parents' deaths, the increasing desperation of her uncle's attempts to marry her off before her modest inheritance ran out. Almost told him about that terrible night at the Ashfords' party and everything that had followed. Instead, she said, "Different, very different from this." Thomas seemed to sense the weight behind her reticence. Sometimes different is what we need, even when it doesn't feel like a choice. And sometimes we discover that what felt like disaster was actually deliverance, Catherine replied, surprising herself with the admission. They had reached a small clearing where the trail forked, and Thomas reined in his horse. "The ranch is down that way," he said, pointing to the left fork. "But there's something up this other trail I think you might like to see, if you have time." Catherine nodded eagerly, and they turned onto the narrower path. It climbed steadily for another 20 minutes before opening into a meadow that took her breath away. They stood at the edge of a natural amphitheater, surrounded by towering peaks that seemed to scrape the sky itself. In the center of the meadow, a small lake reflected the mountains like a mirror, its surface disturbed only by the occasional rise of a feeding trout. "It's beautiful," Catherine whispered, awed by the vastness and serenity of the scene. "I come here sometimes when the noise of town gets too heavy," Thomas said, dismounting and helping Catherine down from Belle's back. Never seems to be anyone else around, too far off the main trails, I suppose. They stood at the water's edge, the horses grazing peacefully behind them. Catherine felt something shift inside her, as if the beauty of the place was calling to parts of herself she'd thought lost forever. Without conscious thought, she found herself telling Thomas about her parents, how they died within 6 months of each other, leaving her an orphan in her uncle's unwelcoming household. "He wasn't cruel," she said, skipping stones across the lake's surface. "Just practical. I was an obligation he hadn't asked for, and he fulfilled it as efficiently as possible. The marriage arrangement with Mr. Henderson was his solution to a problem he'd grown tired of managing." "And what do you want?" Thomas asked quietly. "Not what your uncle wanted or what Henderson expects. What do you want?" The question hung in the mountain air like a challenge. Catherine realized that no one had asked her that in longer than she could remember. What she wanted, what would make her happy, what dreams she carried in the secret chambers of her heart. "I want to matter," she said finally, "not as someone's obligation or ornament, but as myself. I want to do work that means something, help people who need it. I want to wake up in the morning feeling like the day ahead has purpose." She paused, then added more quietly, "And I want to feel safe, to not constantly calculate every word and gesture for its potential consequences." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, watching the water ripple where her stone had disappeared. "Those aren't unreasonable things to want," he said finally. "Any person deserves that much. Even someone with a ruined reputation. Someone who brings scandal rather than respectability to a marriage." The words slipped out before Catherine could stop them, revealing more than she'd intended. Thomas turned to look at her directly, his expression serious but not judgmental. "Especially someone who's been convinced she deserves less," he said firmly. "Catherine, I don't know what happened to you before you came here, but I know it wasn't your fault. Whatever someone told you about your worth, they were wrong." Catherine felt tears threatening for the first time in months. Not the bitter tears of shame and regret she'd grown accustomed to, but something cleaner, born of relief at being seen and believed without explanation or proof. "How can you be so certain?" she whispered. Thomas's answer was simple and devastating in its sincerity. "Because I see who you are when you think no one's watching. The way you help Mrs. Hartwell without being asked. The kindness you show to Belle, to Mrs. Kowalski, to everyone who crosses your path. That's who you really are, Catherine. Everything else is just noise." Standing beside that mountain lake, with the autumn sun warming her face, and Thomas Burke's quiet certainty surrounding her like a shield, Catherine felt something she'd thought lost forever. The possibility that she might someday learn to believe in herself again. The ride back from the mountain lake passed in contemplative silence, both Catherine and Thomas lost in their own thoughts. The conversation by the water had stripped away pretenses neither had realized they were maintaining, leaving them in that vulnerable space where new understanding begins to take root. As Millbrook came into view, Catherine felt the familiar weight of her circumstances settling back onto her shoulders like a heavy cloak. They returned the horses to Thomas's stable just as the afternoon shadows were lengthening. Catherine stood for a moment in the dusty yard, reluctant to break the spell of the day, but knowing she couldn't delay much longer without raising questions from Mrs. Kowalski. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words inadequate for what she truly felt. "For today, for the lake, for listening." Thomas secured Rusty's halter and turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. "Same time tomorrow? Belle will be expecting you now." The assumption that their rides would continue sent a warm flutter through Catherine's chest. "Henderson returns tomorrow evening. This was our last day of freedom. Freedom doesn't have to end just because he returns," Thomas said carefully. There are ways to find time if you're willing to be creative about it. Catherine wanted to believe him, but the reality of her situation pressed down like a physical weight. You don't understand what he's like. The questions, the expectations, the constant observation. He notices everything. Then we'll have to be more careful. Thomas's voice held a determination that surprised her. Catherine, what you experience today, that lightness, that joy, that's not something you should have to give up. Not for anyone. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted them. Mrs. Kowalski appeared around the corner of the building, her expression a mixture of concern and knowing amusement. There you are, child. I was beginning to worry. You'd gotten lost in the mountains. Her eyes flicked meaningfully between Catherine and Thomas. Mr. Henderson sent a telegram. He'll be returning tomorrow afternoon, earlier than expected. Catherine felt her heart sink. Their borrowed time was ending even sooner than anticipated. Thank you for letting me know. Course, dear. Better to be prepared. Mrs. Kowalski's gaze softened as she took in Catherine's windblown hair and bright cheeks. You look healthier than you have since arriving. Mountain air agrees with you. As they walked back toward Henderson's house, Mrs. Kowalski chatted about mundane household matters, but Catherine sensed the older woman was giving her time to compose herself before facing whatever interrogation awaited. It was another small kindness in a day that had been full of them. That evening, as Catherine sat in Henderson's study, attempting to focus on a book of moral essays he'd selected for her improvement, her mind kept drifting to the feel of bells, steady gait beneath her, and the sound of Thomas's voice as he'd spoken her name by the lake. The memory of his words, "I see who you are when you think no one's watching," played through her thoughts like a melody she couldn't quite shake. She found herself touching the small pressed flower she'd secretly picked at the lake, now hidden, between the pages of her journal. It was a tiny rebellion, a tangible reminder of a day when she'd felt like herself again. The fact that she felt the need to hide something so innocent spoke volumes about the life she was walking into. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, matching Catherine's mood as she prepared for Henderson's return. She dressed carefully in one of the new gowns he'd had made for her, a deep blue silk that proclaimed propriety and wealth in equal measure. The dress was beautiful, but it felt like armor, protecting her from the world while simultaneously cutting her off from it. Mrs. Kowalski served breakfast with unusual quiet, both women aware that their easy companionship would soon give way to the formal atmosphere Henderson preferred. Catherine picked at her eggs, her appetite diminished by the prospect of resuming her role as the grateful, docile bride-to-be. Mrs. Kowalski said suddenly, her voice low, "Whatever you found these past few days, that spark in your eyes, don't let it go out completely. Find ways to keep it alive, even if you have to hide it." Catherine looked up, startled by the older woman's intensity. "I don't know if I can. He sees everything, notices every change. Then you'll learn to be cleverer than he is. Women have been surviving difficult men for centuries, child. We're stronger than we know, more resourceful than they give us credit for." Mrs. Kowalski leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And we're better at keeping secrets." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of carriage wheels on gravel. Henderson had arrived earlier than expected. Catherine's stomach clenched as she heard his voice in the front hall, discussing something with the driver about his luggage. In moments, he would enter the dining room, and her brief taste of freedom would officially end. "Catherine, my dear." Henderson appeared in the doorway, resplendent in a new suit that spoke of successful business dealings. "I trust you've passed the time productively in my absence?" "Yes, Mr. Henderson. I've been working on my needlework and reading the essays you recommended." The lies came easily, smoothly, and Catherine hated how natural deception had become. "Excellent. And I have wonderful news from Denver. The lumber contracts exceeded my projections, and I've secured several new investors for the expansion. We'll be hosting a dinner party next week to celebrate, which means you'll need to be prepared to act as hostess." Catherine nodded appropriately, though the prospect of entertaining Henderson's business associates filled her with dread. She would be displayed like a prize, expected to charm without outshining, to be interesting without having opinions, to be the perfect ornament for Henderson's success. "I've also spoken with Reverend Mills about moving up our wedding date," Henderson continued, settling into his chair with the satisfaction of a man whose plans were falling into place. "Given the social obligations that will accompany our increased prosperity, I see no reason to delay. We'll marry this coming Saturday." The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. This Saturday, in 4 days. She had known the wedding was approaching, but the acceleration felt like a trap snapping shut. "So soon," she managed, her voice carefully modulated to suggest surprise rather than panic. "I see no benefit in prolonging an engagement unnecessarily. We're both mature adults who understand the practical nature of our arrangement. Once we're properly married, you can begin taking your place in Denver society as well as Millbrook's." Denver society. Catherine realized with growing horror that Henderson's plans extended far beyond their small mountain town. He intended to use their marriage as a stepping stone to grander social ambitions, which meant even greater scrutiny, higher expectations, and less freedom than she'd imagined possible. The remainder of the day passed in a blur of wedding preparations. Henderson had taken charge of every detail, from the flowers to the menu for the small reception, leaving Catherine with nothing to do but submit to fittings and approve arrangements she had no real say in choosing. By evening, she felt like a stranger in her own life, watching from a distance as her future was organized around her. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind churning with desperate possibilities. She could refuse to go through with the wedding, but where would that leave her? She had no money, no family willing to take her back, no respectable options for a woman in her position. She could run away, disappear into the vast western territories, but the practical difficulties seemed insurmountable. Or she could marry Henderson and spend the rest of her life being gradually erased, becoming the perfect society wife he required. While the woman she really was withered away in darkness, the next morning brought no relief from her growing desperation. Henderson left early for his lumber mill, full of energy and satisfaction at how smoothly his plans were proceeding. Catherine moved through her morning routine like a sleepwalker, helping Mrs. Kowalski with household tasks that felt increasingly pointless. "You're quiet today," Mrs. Kowalski observed as they sorted linens for the wedding reception. Thinking about Saturday, among other things. Catherine folded a tablecloth with mechanical precision. "Did you know he's moved up the date, and that he plans to spend part of our time in Denver?" Mrs. Kowalski's hands stilled on the napkin she'd been pressing. Denver? He didn't mention that before. Apparently his business success requires a more sophisticated social presence. I'm to be part of that presence. Catherine's voice was flat, drained of emotion. "It seems my education and background are assets he plans to exploit." "And how do you feel about that?" Catherine almost laughed at the question, but the sound would have been bitter. "How I feel doesn't seem particularly relevant to anyone's plans. It's relevant to mine," said a quiet voice from the kitchen doorway. Both women turned to find Thomas standing there, his hat in his hands and his expression serious. Mrs. Kowalski took one look at his face and quietly excused herself, leaving Catherine alone with the man who had somehow become the anchor point of her rapidly shifting world. "What are you doing here?" Catherine asked, glancing nervously toward the front of the house. "If Henderson returns, he won't. I saw him at the mill, deep in conversation with his foreman. He'll be there for hours." Thomas stepped into the kitchen, his presence somehow making the large room feel smaller and more intimate. "I heard about the wedding being moved up. Mrs. Mitchell mentioned it when I delivered the new gate hardware to Dr. Mitchell." Catherine nodded miserably. "Saturday, 4 days from now. And you don't want to marry him?" It wasn't a question, but Catherine answered anyway. "What I want has never been part of the equation. This is about survival, about having a roof over my head and food on my table, about not ending up destitute and alone in a world that has no place for women without male protection." Thomas moved closer, close enough that she could see the pain in his eyes as he absorbed her words. "There are other options, Catherine, other ways to survive. Are there? Name one that doesn't involve scandal, poverty, or worse." Catherine's composure finally cracked, months of suppressed emotions spilling out in a rush. "I have no family, no money, no skills that anyone values. The only thing I possessed of any worth was my reputation, and that was destroyed months ago by a man who thought he could take whatever he pleased." The admission hung between them, raw and painful. Thomas absorbed it without flinching, his expression growing gentler rather than shocked. "Tell me," he said simply, and somehow in the warm sanctuary of Mrs. Kowalski's kitchen, with Thomas's steady presence anchoring her, Catherine found herself doing exactly that. She told him about William Ashford and the conservatory, about the wine and the grabbing hands and the torn dress. She told him about the whispers that followed, the gradual social isolation, the way her uncle had made it clear that she was damaged goods who should be grateful for any marriage offer, however distasteful. "He said it was my fault," Catherine finished, her voice barely above a whisper, "that I had encouraged him somehow, led him on. That decent girls don't find themselves in such situations." Thomas's hands had clenched into fists during her recitation, but his voice remained calm and controlled. He was wrong. About all of it. You know that, don't you? Intellectually, perhaps. But knowing something and believing it are different things. Catherine wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "The damage was done, Thomas, not just to my reputation, but to something inside me. I stopped trusting my own judgment, stopped believing I deserved better treatment, and Henderson knew about this when he offered for you. My uncle assured him I was tainted but trainable. Those were his exact words." Catherine's voice carried a bitter edge. "Henderson saw an opportunity to acquire a wife with the proper breeding and education at a significant discount. My past makes me grateful for his attention rather than demanding." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she'd revealed. When he finally spoke, his words were careful and deliberate. "Catherine, I know I have no right to ask this, and I know the practical difficulties seem impossible to overcome. But I can't stand by and watch you sacrifice yourself to a man who sees you as property to be managed." He paused, gathering courage for what came next. "Marry me instead." Catherine stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "What?" "Marry me. Not Saturday, not in some rushed ceremony designed to serve Henderson's ambitions, but properly. Because you want to, because we understand each other, because—" He took a deep breath. "Because I care about you more than I ever expected to care about anyone." "Thomas, you don't understand what you're suggesting. The scandal it would cause, the social consequences. I understand perfectly. I'm suggesting that you choose love over security, hope over resignation, a life that's yours over one that belongs to someone else." Thomas moved closer, close enough to take her hands in his work-roughened ones. "I'm not a wealthy man, Catherine. I can't offer you fine dresses, or grand houses, or social position. But I can offer you respect, partnership, and the chance to discover who you really are when you're not trying to be what someone else wants." Catherine felt her world tilting, as if the kitchen floor had suddenly become the deck of a ship in rough seas. The possibility Thomas was offering seemed as remote as the moon, yet his earnest face made it feel real in a way that Henderson's elaborate plans never had. People would talk, she said weakly. Henderson would be furious. The whole town would let them talk. We'll go somewhere new if we have to. Start fresh where no one knows our history. Thomas's grip on her hands tightened. Catherine, I've been half alive since I came to Colorado, going through the motions but never really living. These past few days, watching you discover joy again, seeing you laugh and ride and simply exist without fear, you've awakened something. In me, I thought was dead. Tears were streaming down Catherine's face now, but they felt different from the bitter tears she'd grown accustomed to. These carried hope along with pain, possibility along with grief for what might have been. I'm afraid, she whispered. Afraid to believe this could work, afraid to trust my judgment again, afraid that I'm not strong enough to choose the harder path. Then we'll be afraid together, Thomas said gently. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Catherine. It's moving forward despite the fear, because what you're moving toward matters more than what you're leaving behind. Outside, storm clouds were gathering again, darkening the kitchen despite the early hour. But inside, surrounded by the warmth of Mrs. Kowalski's domain and the steady certainty of Thomas's presence, Catherine felt something shift deep within. Her chest, the tight knot of resignation that had lived there for months, began to loosen, replaced by something she'd almost forgotten how to feel. If I said yes, she said carefully, how would we even manage it? Henderson expects to marry me. Saturday, the whole town knows about the engagement. We can't simply announce a change of grooms without causing an enormous scandal. Thomas's smile was soft but determined. Leave that to me. And to Mrs. Kowalski. I suspect she's been listening from the pantry and has ideas of her own about how to handle difficult men. As if summoned by her name, Mrs. Kowalski appeared in the doorway, her expression a mixture of maternal protectiveness and shrewd calculation. Indeed I do, she said firmly. And the first thing you two need to understand is that timing is everything. Henderson's expecting a docile bride who'll do as she's told. Let's give him exactly what he expects, right up until the moment we don't. Catherine looked between Thomas and Mrs. Kowalski, these two unlikely allies who were offering her something she'd never thought to hope for, the chance to choose her own destiny, however uncertain it might be. What would we have to do? She asked, her voice growing stronger with each word. Mrs. Kowalski's smile was positively predatory. Oh, my dear girl, we're going to plan a wedding, just not the one Henderson thinks he's getting. As the three conspirators bent their heads together over the kitchen table, Catherine felt the last of her resignation crumble away. For the first time since arriving in Millbrook, she wasn't just surviving, she was planning to live, and the difference she was discovering was everything. The afternoon passed in urgent, whispered planning. Kowalski proved to be a surprisingly cunning strategist, her years of observing Henderson's routines and weaknesses providing valuable intelligence. Thomas contributed his knowledge of the legal requirements and his connections with people who might be willing to help, while Catherine found herself thinking more clearly than she had in months. The key, Mrs. Kowalski explained, is to wait until the very last moment. Henderson's pride won't let him cancel the wedding publicly. Too much loss of face. But if a different groom appears at the altar with all the proper paperwork? She shrugged eloquently. It would be a fait accompli, Catherine said slowly, beginning to understand the audacious simplicity of the plan. By the time he realized what was happening, it would be too late to stop. Exactly. And afterwards, well, that's when things might get complicated. Thomas's expression was serious. We'd need to be prepared to leave Millbrook immediately. Henderson isn't the type to accept such a public humiliation gracefully. Catherine nodded, her mind already racing ahead to the practical considerations. I have a little money. Not much, but enough for train tickets and a modest start somewhere new. And I have my tools and my trade. A blacksmith can find work anywhere there are horses and metal to be shaped. Thomas reached across the table to cover her hand with his. Are you certain about this, Catherine? Once we start down this path, there's no turning back. Looking into his eyes, Catherine felt the last of her doubts dissolve. Here was a man who saw her clearly, not as an ornament or a problem to be solved, but as a partner worthy of respect and love. The choice, when viewed that way, was surprisingly easy. I'm certain, she said firmly. For the first time in months, I'm absolutely certain. Outside, the storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, sending rain against the windows, in sheets. But inside the warm kitchen, 3 people continued planning a rebellion that would give Catherine Walsh the chance to become whoever she was meant to be, starting with becoming Catherine Burke. As the afternoon wore on and their plans took shape, Catherine found herself thinking about the pressed flower hidden in her journal upstairs. Soon, she would no longer need to hide such simple tokens of joy. Soon she could pick flowers openly, ride horses without permission, and discover what her laughter sounded like when it wasn't measured and controlled. The thought filled her with a giddy sense of anticipation that had nothing to do with wedding dresses and everything to do with freedom. For the first time in her life, she was choosing her own future, and the man who would share it with her. Saturday couldn't come soon. Enough. Thursday morning arrived with deceptive calm, the kind of peaceful dawn that belied the storm brewing beneath Millbrook's tranquil surface. Catherine woke before sunrise, her mind immediately sharp with the weight of their conspiracy. In less than 48 hours, she would either be walking down the aisle toward Thomas Burke and a future she chose, or facing Henderson's wrath and the collapse of everything they'd planned. She dressed with unusual care, selecting a modest brown dress that would allow her to move freely through town without drawing attention. Today's mission required careful coordination. While Henderson believed she was focused on final wedding preparations, Catherine would actually be putting the finishing touches on a plan that would shatter his expectations entirely. Mrs. Kowalski was already in the kitchen when Catherine descended, her movements brisk with nervous energy. The older woman had thrown herself into their conspiracy with an enthusiasm that suggested she'd been waiting years for the chance to thwart Marcus Henderson's controlling nature. "Sleep at all?" Mrs. Kowalski asked, pouring coffee with hands that trembled slightly. "Some. You?" "Not a wink. Keep thinking about all the ways this could go wrong." Mrs. Kowalski set down the pot with more force than necessary. "But then I remember the look on your face when you came back from that ride Tuesday, and I know we're doing the right thing." Their conversation was interrupted by Henderson's appearance in the doorway, already dressed for business despite the early hour. His satisfied expression suggested a man whose world was unfolding exactly according to his plans. "Good morning, my dear. I trust you're feeling appropriately excited about Saturday's ceremony?" His tone carried the expectation of enthusiastic agreement. "Of course," Catherine replied, schooling her features into what she hoped resembled bridal anticipation. "It's all happening so quickly. The best decisions are made with decisive action, not endless deliberation." Henderson accepted his coffee from Mrs. Kowalski without acknowledgement, already absorbed in the newspaper he'd brought to the table. "I've arranged for the photographer from Denver to arrive Friday evening. We'll want formal portraits to commemorate the occasion." Catherine nodded appropriately while her mind raced. A photographer meant additional complications, more witnesses to their deception, more people who would need to be managed during the crucial moments when their plan unfolded. "I'll need to finalize arrangements with the florist today," she said, seizing the opportunity to establish her need for mobility, "and I promised Mrs. Caldwell I'd stop by to discuss the reception details." Admirable attention to detail. Yes, by all means, handle those feminine concerns. I'll be occupied with business matters most of the day. Henderson folded his newspaper with decisive snaps. Oh, and Catherine, do ensure that your dress fitting goes smoothly. I want everything to reflect properly on our family's standing. A family. The possessive pronoun sent a chill through Catherine, but she managed to keep her expression serene. Naturally, after Henderson departed for his lumber mill, Catherine and Mrs. Kowalski abandoned all pretense of normal household routine. They had work to do and precious little time to accomplish it. First stop is Dr. Mitchell's house, Mrs. Kowalski said, pulling on her coat. Sarah Mitchell is the only person in this town who can keep a secret when it matters, and will need her help with the legal paperwork. They walked through Millbrook's quiet streets like women on ordinary errands, but Catherine felt as though every step was carrying her toward a precipice. The familiar buildings looked different now, charged with the significance of what might be her last day among them as Catherine Walsh. Sarah Mitchell received them in her comfortable parlor, her intelligent eyes taking in their serious expressions with immediate understanding. As the doctor's wife, she'd learned to read between the lines of what people said and what they actually meant. "This is about Saturday's wedding, isn't it?" she said before either visitor could speak. "I wondered when someone would finally challenge Marcus Henderson's assumption that he could arrange the world to his specifications." Mrs. Kowalski glanced at Catherine, who nodded slightly. Their conspiracy was about to expand beyond the original three. "We need your help," Catherine said simply, "and your discretion." Sarah's smile was both knowing and encouraging. "You have both. Now, tell me what you need." The explanation took nearly an hour, with each woman contributing details and contingencies to their growing plan. Sarah proved to be as strategically minded as Mrs. Kowalski, her suggestions refining their approach until it began to feel genuinely feasible rather than desperately optimistic. "The marriage license is the key," Sarah explained, spreading papers across her writing desk. "Samuel keeps blank forms in his office for emergencies. Frontier life doesn't always allow for proper advance planning. If we can arrange for Thomas to appear as the groom on the official paperwork, Henderson will assume it's a clerical error until it's too late to correct," Catherine finished, her excitement growing as the pieces fell into place. "Exactly. By the time he realizes what's happened, you'll be legally married to the man of your choosing, not his." Sarah's eyes sparkled with mischief. The look on his face will be worth any social complications that follow. They spent another hour working through details, timing, and potential complications. Each woman would have specific responsibilities during the crucial hours before and during the ceremony. Most importantly, they established communication methods that would allow them to coordinate without arousing Henderson's suspicions. "One more thing," Sarah said as they prepared to leave. "You'll need somewhere to go immediately after the ceremony. Henderson won't accept this gracefully, and you can't remain in Millbrook once he realizes what's happened." Catherine felt a pang of sadness at the thought of leaving so soon after arriving, but she pushed it aside. Freedom always came with a price, and exile from a place she'd barely begun to call home seemed a small one compared to a lifetime of servitude. "Thomas mentioned heading north toward Montana Territory," she said. "There are mining towns that need blacksmiths, places where we could start fresh without our history following us." "Then that's what you'll do. Samuel can write letters of introduction, professional, recommendations that will help Thomas find work quickly." Sarah embraced Catherine warmly. "You're braver than you know, dear. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." From the Mitchell house, Catherine and Mrs. Kowalski proceeded to the dress shop for Catherine's final fitting. This routine appointment served as perfect cover for their real mission, meeting with Thomas to coordinate the final details of their plan. They found him in the alley behind Miss Adelaide's shop, ostensibly delivering a repaired bridle to the seamstress, but actually waiting for their prearranged rendezvous. His face showed the strain of the past 2 days, but his eyes brightened when he saw Catherine approaching. "Any problems with the paperwork?" he asked quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't observed. "Sarah Mitchell has everything arranged. The license will be properly filed with your name instead of Henderson's." Catherine kept her voice low, but she couldn't suppress the note of excitement that crept in. "It's really gonna work, isn't it? If we don't lose our nerve." Thomas reached out briefly to squeeze her hand, a gesture that sent warmth through her entire body. "Catherine, are you absolutely certain about this? Once we exchange vows, there's no undoing what we've done." Looking into his earnest face, Catherine felt the last of her doubts evaporate. This man who had shown her kindness without expectation, who had offered her respect without conditions, who had seen her worth when she'd forgotten it herself, marrying him wasn't a desperate escape from Henderson's control. It was a choice made from strength, not weakness. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," she said firmly. "Have you changed your mind?" Thomas's smile was answer enough, but he gave voice to his certainty anyway. "Not for a moment. Tomorrow can't come soon enough." Mrs. Kowalski, who had been keeping watch while they talked, suddenly straightened. "Someone's coming. Catherine, you need to get inside for that fitting." Catherine slipped into the dress shop's back entrance, while Thomas melted away down the alley. To any observer, it would appear that she'd simply arrived for her appointment while he'd finished his delivery business. The deception was becoming easier with practice, but Catherine knew that tomorrow would test their acting abilities to their limits. The dress fitting proceeded with surreal normalcy. Miss Adelaide fussed over hem lengths and seam adjustments, while Catherine stood motionless, her mind occupied with plans that had nothing to do with the elaborate white gown being pinned around her. The dress was beautiful. Henderson had spared no expense in ensuring his bride would make an appropriate impression, but it felt like a costume for a role she no longer intended to play. "You seem distracted today, dear," Miss Adelaide observed, her mouth full of pins. "Pre-wedding nerves, I suppose." "Something like that," Catherine replied, which was certainly true, if not in the way the seamstress assumed, perfectly natural. "Marriage is a big step, especially when you're joining such a prominent family. Mr. Henderson has very specific ideas about how things should be done." Miss Adelaide's tone carried a note of sympathy that suggested she understood the challenges Catherine would face. "Yes, he does," Catherine agreed, thinking of the very specific ideas Henderson had about his bride's behavior, appearance, and function in his carefully ordered world. Ideas that would become irrelevant in less than 24 hours. The fitting concluded with promises that the dress would be delivered Friday evening, giving Catherine time for any final adjustments. As she prepared to leave, Miss Adelaide surprised her by speaking quietly. "Miss Walsh, if I may say so, you deserve to be happy. Don't let anyone convince you that happiness is selfish or unrealistic. A woman needs more than security to make a good life." Catherine stared at the older woman, wondering if her intentions were somehow visible despite their careful secrecy. But Miss Adelaide simply smiled and began tidying her pins, leaving Catherine to puzzle over whether the comment had been coincidental wisdom or something more purposeful. The afternoon brought the most challenging test yet, accompanying Henderson to a meeting with Reverend Mills to finalize the ceremony details. Catherine had to sit beside her intended groom, nodding appropriately as they discussed vows she had no intention of honoring and arrangements that would never come to pass. Reverend Mills was a kindly man in his 60s, with the gentle manner of someone who genuinely cared about the spiritual welfare of his congregation. He spoke earnestly about the sacred nature of marriage, the importance of mutual respect and understanding, the need for both partners to enter the union with honest hearts. "I always like to speak privately with couples before their wedding," he said, his weathered hands folded peacefully in his lap. "It gives me a chance to address any concerns or answer questions about the commitment you're making." Henderson shifted impatiently. I hardly think that's necessary, Reverend. We're both mature adults who understand what we're undertaking. Nevertheless, I find these conversations invaluable. Would this evening be convenient? Perhaps after dinner. Catherine felt panic flutter in her chest. A private interview with the minister could derail everything if he sensed her reluctance, or if Henderson detected her deception. But refusing would raise suspicions they couldn't afford. "Of course," she heard herself saying. "We'd be happy to speak with you." Henderson looked annoyed by what he clearly considered an unnecessary formality, but he couldn't object without appearing impious. "Very well. Shall we say 8 o'clock? As they left the church, Henderson's irritation was evident in his clipped stride and the sharp way he handed Catherine into their carriage. "Meddlesome old fool," he muttered, "as if our private affairs are any of his concern beyond performing the ceremony." Catherine murmured something appropriately agreeable while her mind raced through the implications. Tonight's interview would require all her acting skills, and any misstep could expose their conspiracy at the worst possible moment. That evening, as she prepared for their meeting with Reverend Mills, Catherine found herself thinking about the vows she would speak tomorrow. Not the ones Henderson expected, but the promises she would make to Thomas Burke with an honest heart. The difference felt profound, transformative in a way that had little to do with legal contracts and everything to do with choosing love over convenience. Mrs. Kowalski helped her dress in a modest blue gown that projected appropriate solemnity. If for a religious discussion, as she fastened the buttons, the older woman spoke quietly. "Remember, dear, you're not lying to the Reverend about your feelings toward marriage. You do want to be married, just not to the man he thinks you're marrying. Keep that truth in your heart, and the words will come naturally." The advice proved invaluable during the actual interview. Reverend Mills asked thoughtful questions about their expectations for married life, their understanding of the commitment they were making, their hopes for the future. Catherine found she could answer honestly about her desire for partnership, respect, and the chance to build something meaningful with another person. That these answers applied to Thomas rather than Henderson was her secret to keep. Henderson dominated the conversation as usual, expounding on his vision of marriage as a practical arrangement between rational adults. His responses revealed his view of Catherine as a valuable acquisition rather than a partner, though he couched his possessiveness in language that sounded appropriately romantic to casual ears. "And you, Miss Walsh?" Reverend Mills asked eventually. "What do you hope to find in marriage?" Catherine met his kind eyes and spoke from her heart. "I hope to find acceptance, Reverend, understanding, the chance to be valued for who I truly am rather than what someone wishes me to become. I want to wake up each morning knowing that I matter to another person, not as an ornament or obligation, but as a partner in building a life together." The minister smiled warmly. "Those are wise aspirations, my dear. Marriage at its best is indeed a partnership of equals, each supporting the other's growth and happiness." Henderson looked pleased by what he interpreted as Catherine's appropriate sentiments, having no idea that her words had nothing to do with him. The irony might have been amusing if the stakes weren't so high. The interview concluded with Reverend Mills's blessing on their union and final reminders about the timing for Saturday's ceremony. As they prepared to leave, he took Catherine's hand gently. "My dear, I sense in you a young woman of deep feeling and strong character. Trust those qualities to guide you toward happiness, whatever form it may take." Catherine felt tears threaten at the unexpected benediction. Somehow, without knowing the details of their conspiracy, Reverend Mills had given her exactly the encouragement she needed for the ordeal ahead. Friday dawned with crystalline clarity, the kind of perfect autumn day that seemed designed for new beginnings. Catherine woke early, her body humming with nervous energy. This was the last day she would spend as Henderson's intended bride, the final 24 hours of a role she'd never wanted to play. Henderson left early for a final business meeting before taking the afternoon off to prepare for their wedding. His satisfaction was evident in every gesture, the careful arrangement of his appearance, the proprietary way he kissed Catherine's cheek, the assumption that tomorrow would mark the beginning of his perfectly ordered domestic life. Until this. "Evening, my dear," he said as he departed. "The photographer will arrive at 6 and we'll want formal portraits before the dinner party. Do try to rest today. I want you looking your absolute best tomorrow." After his carriage disappeared down the street, Catherine and Mrs. Kowalski abandoned all pretense. They had work to do, and precious little time to complete it. The day passed in a blur of final preparations that had nothing to do with the wedding Henderson expected. Messages were sent, arrangements confirmed, contingency plans reviewed. Thomas stopped by briefly during the afternoon, ostensibly to deliver a repaired kitchen utensil, but actually to receive final instructions and reassurance. "Second thoughts?" he asked quietly, as Mrs. Kowalski kept watch by the window. "Third and fourth thoughts," Catherine admitted. "But not about you, about us. Only about whether we can actually pull this off without someone getting hurt." "We can," Thomas said with quiet confidence. "And even if there are consequences, they'll be worth it. Catherine, whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know. These past weeks, getting to know you, seeing your strength emerge, it's changed. Everything for me. You've changed everything." His words steadied her more than any amount of planning or preparation could have. Tomorrow wasn't just about escaping Henderson's control. It was about choosing a future with a man who saw her clearly and loved what he saw. As evening approached and the time for Henderson's photographer drew near, Catherine prepared to play her role one last time. She dressed in her finest gown, arranged her hair with care, and painted on the serene smile of a happy bride-to-be. But underneath the performance, she carried the secret knowledge that tomorrow would bring not submission, but liberation, not the end of her story, but its true beginning. And that knowledge transformed even her most convincing smiles into something genuine, not happiness about marrying Henderson, but joy at the prospect of choosing her own destiny at last. The photographer arrived precisely at 6, a serious man from Denver who set about his work with professional efficiency. Henderson posed Catherine in various arrangements around his house, each image designed to showcase his prosperity and taste. Through it all, Catherine smiled and positioned herself, as directed, playing the part of the grateful bride while her heart soared with anticipation for tomorrow's rebellion. "Beautiful work," the photographer declared as he packed his equipment. "These portraits will be worthy of such an important occasion." Henderson preened at the compliment, already envisioning how the photographs would enhance his social standing. He had no idea he was documenting the end of his plans rather than their fulfillment. As the evening wound down and Catherine prepared for what might be her last night in Henderson's house, she felt a profound sense of completion. Tomorrow, whatever its challenges, would mark the beginning of her real life. Not the pale imitation she'd been living, but the full, rich existence she was finally brave enough to claim. Standing at her bedroom window, looking out at the mountains that had become synonymous with possibility, Catherine Walsh prepared to become Catherine Burke. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, the future looked not like a burden to be endured, but like an adventure waiting to unfold. Saturday. Morning arrived with the crisp promise of autumn's full arrival. Catherine woke before dawn, her heart hammering against her ribs as the magnitude of what lay ahead crashed over her like a cold wave. This was the day she would either claim her freedom or face catastrophic consequences for her rebellion. The house felt different in the pre-dawn darkness, charged with anticipation and the weight of secrets. Mrs. Kowalski was already moving about in the kitchen, her usual efficiency tempered by nervous energy. They exchanged meaningful glances, but spoke little, both women acutely aware that Henderson might appear at any moment. True to form, he emerged from his room precisely at 7, already dressed and groomed to perfection. His satisfaction radiated from every gesture as he surveyed his domain on what he believed would be his wedding day. "A glorious morning for our ceremony," he announced, accepting his coffee with the air of a man whose world was unfolding exactly according to plan. "I've had word that several prominent businessmen from Denver will be attending. This union will open doors I've been working toward for years." Catherine nodded appropriately while her stomach churned. The guest list he'd compiled without consulting her included influential strangers who would witness either her triumph or her humiliation. There would be no quiet failure if their plan collapsed. "I trust you're feeling appropriately honored by the significance of this day." Henderson's question carried its usual expectation of grateful agreement. "I understand the importance of what's happening," Catherine replied carefully, which was certainly true, if not in the way he intended. The morning hours crept by with agonizing slowness. Catherine helped Mrs. Kowalski with breakfast preparations while listening for any sounds that might indicate their conspiracy had been discovered. Every knock at the door, every approaching footstep sent her pulse racing, but the expected catastrophe never materialized. At 10 o'clock, the first of Henderson's invited guests began arriving for the pre-ceremony breakfast. Catherine found herself greeting strangers who spoke knowingly about her fortunate match and Henderson's excellent choice in acquiring such a refined bride. Their language reinforced everything she'd come to despise about her situation, the casual assumption that she was property to be acquired rather than a person making choices. "Such a quiet creature," observed Mrs. Victoria Pemberton, a banker's wife from Denver whose elaborate hat seemed designed to announce her importance. "Marcus, you've chosen well. Docile wives make for peaceful households." Henderson preened under the compliment, while Catherine maintained her serene expression. If only these people knew what was brewing beneath the surface of their tidy assumptions. The breakfast concluded without incident, though Catherine noticed Dr. Mitchell exchanging meaningful glances with his wife Sarah. Their presence among Henderson's guests provided crucial cover for the medical licenses and paperwork that would soon make her deception legally binding. As the guests departed to prepare for the afternoon ceremony, Catherine retreated to her room to change into her wedding dress. The elaborate gown waited like a white monument to Henderson's expectations, beautiful, expensive, and entirely symbolic of a life she refused to accept. Mrs. Kowalski helped her into the dress with hands that shook slightly, both women aware they were participating in an elaborate piece of theatre. The reflection in the mirror showed a proper bride, but Catherine could see the steel in her own eyes that had nothing to do with bridal excitement. "You look beautiful, dear," Mrs. Kowalski whispered, adjusting the veil with tender care, "and brave, braver than anyone will ever know." A soft knock interrupted the moment. Dr. Mitchell's voice called through the door with studied casualness. "Mrs. Kowalski, could you spare a moment to help my wife with something in the kitchen?" The older woman squeezed Catherine's hand once and slipped out, leaving her alone with her reflection and the weight of approaching destiny. Through the window, she could see carriages beginning to arrive at the church across the square. In less than 2 hours, she would either be married to Thomas Burke or facing Henderson's wrath as a failed conspirator. The knock that came 30 minutes later was expected, but still made her jump. Henderson's voice carried through the door. With unusual gentleness, "Catherine, my dear, it's time to depart for the church." She opened the door to find him resplendent in formal attire, his expression radiating satisfaction and possession. For just a moment, looking at his confident face, Catherine felt a flutter of doubt. Was she truly prepared to humiliate this Man publicly, regardless of his faults? Was she brave enough to face the consequences of such a dramatic rebellion? Then she remembered his casual cruelty, his assumption that her thoughts and feelings were irrelevant to their arrangement, his view of her as ornamental property. The doubt evaporated, replaced by steely determination. "You look magnificent," Henderson said, offering his arm. "Exactly as I envisioned my bride should appear." They descended to the waiting carriage in procession, Henderson proud and proprietary, Catherine serene and secret. Mrs. Kowalski watched from the kitchen window, her expression mixing worry with fierce hope. The short ride to the church passed in tense silence. Henderson appeared lost in satisfaction, while Catherine used the time to center herself for the performance ahead. Everything depended on maintaining her facade until the crucial moment when Thomas would step forward to claim his rightful place. The church was fuller than Catherine had expected, with curious townspeople filling the pews alongside Henderson's invited guests. News of the accelerated wedding had spread through Millbrook's social networks, drawing everyone eager to witness what promised to be the social event of the season. As they approached the altar where Reverend Mills waited with his prayer book, Catherine spotted Thomas in the back pew. Their eyes met briefly, his steady and reassuring, hers conveying silent thanks for his presence. In just minutes, he would either save her from a life of elegant servitude, or they would both face exile from everything familiar. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Mills began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church, "we are gathered here today in the sight of God and this community to witness the union of Marcus Henderson and Catherine Walsh in holy matrimony." Catherine felt Henderson's grip tighten on her arm as he savored this public acknowledgement of his success. Around them, the congregation settled into attentive silence, ready to witness what they assumed would be a conventional ceremony. But as Reverend Mills continued with the traditional opening words, Catherine noticed Dr. Mitchell rise quietly from his seat and approach the altar. He carried what appeared to be official documents, the marriage license that would make everything legal and binding. "Before we proceed," Dr. Mitchell said quietly, "there seems to be a small clerical correction needed regarding the groom's name on the license." Henderson frowned, clearly annoyed by any interruption to his perfect ceremony. "What sort of correction?" "Nothing significant," Dr. Mitchell replied smoothly, extending the papers toward Reverend Mills. "Just ensuring all the documentation is properly aligned with the county records." Catherine held her breath as the minister examined the paperwork. This was the moment of truth. Either their deception would hold, or everything would collapse in public disaster. Reverend Mills studied the documents with the careful attention of a man accustomed to legal precision. The seconds stretched like hours, while Catherine maintained her bridal composure, and Henderson waited impatiently for the minor administrative detail to be resolved. "Yes, I see the issue," the minister said finally. "The license has been corrected to reflect the proper groom. Shall we proceed?" Henderson nodded curtly, still focused on his approaching triumph. He had no reason to examine the paperwork closely. In his mind, there was only one possible groom for this ceremony. "Do you, Thomas Burke?" Reverend Mills began, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden electric silence, "take Catherine Walsh to be your lawfully wedded wife?" The words hit the congregation like a thunderclap. Henderson's face went through a rapid progression of confusion, disbelief, and dawning fury as Thomas stepped forward from the back of the church, his expression resolute and his movement steady. "I do," Thomas said clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly buzzing church. Henderson's grip on Catherine's arm tightened painfully as he struggled to process what was happening. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his carefully modulated tone beginning to crack. "The meaning," Catherine said, finding her voice, "at last, is that I'm marrying the man I choose to marry." She stepped away from Henderson's side and moved toward Thomas, her white dress rustling in the stunned silence. Around them, the congregation erupted in whispers and gasps, but Catherine had eyes only for the man who had offered her freedom and respect. "Do you, Catherine Walsh," Reverend Mills continued with admirable composure, "take Thomas Burke to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Looking into Thomas's storm-grey eyes, Catherine felt the last of her fear evaporate. "I do," she said firmly, her voice carrying clearly to every shocked witness. Henderson found his voice then, his fury finally overcoming his bewilderment. "This is preposterous. I am the intended groom. This woman is contracted to marry me." "The legal documentation says otherwise," Dr. Mitchell interjected smoothly, producing additional paperwork. "Miss Walsh has exercised her right to choose her own spouse, as is proper under territorial law. By the power vested in me by Colorado Territory," Reverend Mills declared, raising his voice above the growing commotion, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Thomas kissed his bride then, gently but firmly, sealing their union before Henderson could mount any further protest. The kiss tasted of freedom and possibility, of courage rewarded and love finally acknowledged. The congregation was in full uproar now, with guests rising from their seats and voices raised in amazement, outrage, and grudging admiration. Through it all, Catherine stood beside her new husband, no longer the passive victim of other people's plans, but a woman who had claimed her own destiny. Henderson's face had gone from red to white, his carefully constructed social facade crumbling under the weight of public humiliation. "You will regret this," he snarled, his voice low and venomous. "Both of you will rue the day you made a fool of Marcus Henderson." "The only fool here," Thomas replied quietly, "is a man who thought he could purchase another human being's life." Mrs. Kowalski appeared at Catherine's side then, having materialized from wherever she'd been hiding during the ceremony. Her arms were full of Catherine's traveling clothes and personal belongings, everything necessary for an immediate departure. "Time to go, dear ones," she whispered urgently. "The carriage is waiting." They moved quickly toward the church's side exit, while Henderson continued to rant about legal challenges and social consequences. Some of the congregation seemed scandalized by the dramatic turn of events, but Catherine noticed others, particularly some of the women, whose faces showed something that looked suspiciously like approval. Sarah Mitchell caught Catherine's arm as they passed. "Go quickly," she murmured. "Samuel has everything arranged. Your new life starts now." They emerged into brilliant afternoon sunlight to find a carriage waiting exactly as promised, with Belle tied behind and all of Thomas's essential tools loaded and ready. Mrs. Kowalski had thought of everything, down to a basket of food for their journey and warm clothes for the mountain crossing ahead. "Thank you," Catherine whispered, embracing the woman who had become far more than a housekeeper during their brief but crucial alliance. "For everything." "Thank me for being happy," Mrs. Kowalski replied, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Be everything that man would never have let you become." Thomas helped Catherine into the carriage, pausing only to shake Dr. Mitchell's hand, and receive a packet of letters that would help him find work in whatever community they chose to call home. As they pulled away from the church, Henderson emerged onto the steps, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. "This isn't over," he shouted after their departing carriage. "I'll find you. I'll make you pay for this." But his threats carried no real power now. Catherine was legally married to Thomas Burke, protected by territorial law and her own newfound courage. Whatever consequences lay ahead, they would face them together as partners rather than as master and possession. As Millbrook fell away behind them and the road stretched toward the mountains, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in longer than she could remember. Pure, uncomplicated joy. She had chosen love over security, courage over comfort, and the gamble had paid off beyond her wildest hopes. "Any regrets?" Thomas asked as they settled into the rhythm of travel, Belle keeping an easy pace beside their carriage. Catherine considered the question seriously. Behind them lay everything familiar: the town that had briefly been home, the comfortable prison of Henderson's house, the safe but soul-crushing path of conventional expectations. Ahead lay uncertainty, adventure, and the challenge of building something entirely new. "None," she said firmly, lacing her fingers through his. "Not a single one." The mountains welcomed them with crisp air and endless sky, with the promise of communities that had never heard of Catherine Walsh or Marcus Henderson, places where a skilled blacksmith and his resourceful wife could build whatever life they chose to create. That night, they made camp beside a stream that sang its way down from the peaks above. Thomas built a fire while Catherine unpacked Mrs. Kowalski's carefully prepared supplies, marveling at the simple domestic rhythm they'd already established. This wasn't the elegant household Henderson had envisioned, but it was theirs, earned through courage and sealed with honest vows. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked, noting her contemplative expression as she watched the flames dance. "About laughing," Catherine replied, surprising them both with the answer. "I was remembering what it felt like before everything went wrong, and realizing that I can feel it again, that lightness, that possibility of joy, as if summoned." By her words, laughter bubbled up from some deep place that had been locked away for months. It started quietly, then grew until it filled the mountain silence with pure delight. Thomas joined her, their combined mirth echoing off the surrounding peaks like a celebration. When the laughter finally subsided, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the vast western sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new places, new opportunities to discover who they could become together. But tonight, beside their campfire in the Colorado wilderness, Catherine Burke, for that was her name now, felt something she'd almost forgotten how to feel. She felt free. The next morning brought sunshine and the sound of water running over stones. Catherine woke to find Thomas already moving about their camp, preparing coffee and checking their horses with the easy competence that had first drawn her to him. Watching him work, she realized that this was what partnership looked like, not the elegant performance Henderson had envisioned, but the daily sharing of tasks and responsibilities by two people who genuinely cared for each other's welfare. "Good morning, Mrs. Burke," Thomas said, offering her a cup of coffee with a smile that made her heart skip. "Good morning, husband," she replied, testing out the word and finding it fit perfectly. They broke camp efficiently, working together with the natural coordination of people who were learning to move through life as a team. As they prepared to continue their journey north toward Montana territory, and whatever new adventures awaited them there, Catherine took one last look back toward Millbrook. Somewhere beyond those mountains, Marcus Henderson was probably still, raging about his public humiliation, already planning how to salvage his reputation from the wreckage of his wedding day. Mrs. Kowalski was likely fielding questions from curious neighbors while secretly savoring her role in the dramatic reversal. The story would be told and retold until it became part of Millbrook's local folklore, the tale of the mail-order bride who chose love over convenience and changed her destiny at the altar. But Catherine felt no lingering connection to any of it. Her real life had begun the moment she said "I do" to Thomas Burke, and everything before that was simply a prologue to the story they would write together. As their carriage rolled toward the horizon and Belle nickered contentedly beside them, Catherine Burke laughed again. Not the careful, measured response Henderson had demanded, but the full, free sound of a woman who had rediscovered joy and intended to keep it forever. The mountains ahead held infinite possibilities, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Catherine couldn't wait to discover what came next. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.